I'm Stephen Bartkus, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society. On behalf of Suzanne Brennan, the Executive Director of Lounsbury House, and myself, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation, Architectural Gems of Ridgefield, with Phil Esser, Mary Dunne, and Tracy Seem. Thank you to Carla Murtaugh Holmes and Doyle Coffin Architecture for generously sponsoring this event. Thank you also to Suzanne and the entire team here at Lounsbury House, our favorite nonprofit partners in Ridgefield, for co-sponsoring this presentation and for allowing us to use this beautiful space for tonight's program. Thank you to Mary Dunne and her team at the State Historic Preservation Office for the generous grant which allowed the Historic Resources Inventory Project, and which you'll be hearing about this evening. And thank you to the town of Ridgefield, First Select Person Rudy Marconi, Dan O'Brien, the chair of the Historic District Commission, for partnering with the Historical Society on this important project. Lounsbury House and Ridgefield Historical Society are independent nonprofit organizations dedicated to preserving Ridgefield's history and historic town-owned buildings like this one that we're in tonight. And thank you to the generosity of our donors and our members for making this possible. To all of our members in attendance, thank you for your continuing support. If you're not yet a member of either organization, I encourage you to do so and join us in preserving Ridgefield's history and historic buildings. Please visit lounsburyhouse.org and ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org to make a contribution, to get more involved in our organizations, and to learn about our many upcoming events. For tonight, our speakers are Phil Esser. He's a native of Ridgefield, and he is a historic preservation specialist with an emphasis on architectural history and historic building documentation. Phil joined the board of the Historical Society over 20 years ago and remains active on the board, serving as the chair of the Historic Preservation Committee and recently formed Architectural Archives Committee. Phil has resided in California and New Mexico for the past 16 years, documenting historic Cold War era rocket and missile test facilities for the military. Mary Dunne is an architectural historian with the State Historic Preservation Office. In this capacity, she is the Municipal Preservation Services and Grants Coordinator, an advisor and trainer for the 86 local historical commissions across the state. Prior to working for the State Historic Preservation Office, Mary was the executive director of the Manchester Historical Society in Manchester, Connecticut, and was preservation services officer for the New Haven Trust, the New Haven Preservation Trust. Tracy Seem, the former president and current member of the board of directors of the Ridgefield Historical Society, is an educator at the Philip Johnson Glass House, a National Trust for Historic Preservation site, where she has led public and private tours for the past 8 years. She also serves as senior account manager for East Coast in Canada at Bassam Fellows, where she leads tours, manages special events, and assists with exhibitions at the studio's headquarters, the Philip Johnson designed Schlumberger Administration Building here in Ridgefield. Please join me in welcoming them to the Lounsbury House.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's always a treat to be back in my hometown. I didn't really want to leave, but I found that the dream job of my life doing these Cold War missile testing facilities. It's my friends, they're genuinely angry at me that I stole their jobs. But I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is a real honor. And Tracy Seem, who was introduced, and Mary Dunne, who was with the state. And I want to do a real brief introduction of the purposes of this presentation. This is the third in the series. The first I did was with Keith Jones in 2024, and where I focused on historic American architecture. And then about 5 years ago, I believe, I did 300 years of Ridgefield history. And that was really the presentation on the true gems, the the creme de la creme, if you will, of Ridgefield architecture. The purpose of this is twofold. One, to sort of bring more awareness into the importance of, the importance of understanding our built environment. I mean, we sometimes tear down buildings and do things and we're not really that aware of it, but I noticed that people in Ridgefield are becoming increasingly aware of it. And so we thought this would be a good opportunity. A couple of years ago, I put together some grants. A little higher? I'm sorry. Put together, let me turn up the volume a little so I don't have to. Put together a couple of grants with the state, and Mary Dunne, who will be speaking soon, assisted me with getting those grants in place, and we did a historic resources inventory of 300 properties that had not been inventoried in the 1979 survey. And so we decided, let's do a presentation of 20 of those best. So they're not your super high style, fancy buildings in all cases, but they have great character. So again, thank you to Doyle Carpet Architecture. I don't know if Carl is here, but I know that John Doyle is here. And just a little remembrance of our dear friend David Scott, who along with Gene Tipinelli saved the Scott House right here from ruin on Katuna Street and had it reconstructed. Dave was not only an incredible gentleman, he was just a hell of a nice guy, a real Ridgefielder, participated with his kids in the sports, being a coach. He was also not only a fine architect, but a fine artist. And a lot of what I talk about in quality of architecture is what I describe as architecture as art, as opposed to building. And David did renderings that I hadn't seen done since the 20s and 30s of such high quality. This is his own house, a shed style that he did in 1966. And I hired him to do both of these. This is a cottage in Fairfield, Connecticut, and he added the sheep, if you can see it. It was a gardener's cottage, and this is the Pierpont house that he did, that I commissioned him to do for me. So we'll miss you, Dave. So really quickly, which is what everybody says and never turns out that way, I wanted to introduce why do we do these surveys. And as I mentioned earlier, we are a kind of town that really loves our history. We love our built environment. And I mean, it's a testament to all the folks who showed up tonight. And so in 1979, they explained why. And it's interesting that the issues back then were the establishment of diverse corporate headquarters would have Ridgefield lose its identity entirely. So that's when all the big corporations were moving into the suburbs, you know, Danbury and that area and stuff, and that was their concern at the time. Our concern this go around, as a preservationist, we're really supposed to do these every 20 years or so. Well, it's been 40, so I figured it was probably time that we do one, so we put this, the grants together and hired a consultant to help us do this. Our predecessor, Ridgefield Preservation Trust, is the predecessor to the Ridgefield Historical Society, although someone may correct me on that. But they were definitely associated. Here's a good example of some of the issues we faced in recent years. Teardowns and replacements. Now, the point of preservation is to keep that continuity alive, street by street. And when you start eroding that character, and unfortunately, and I'm very biased because I have an eye for good design, I believe, and when I see these period houses being torn down and replaced with things that are not particularly artistic or well executed in design, I think it erodes the character of the streetscape. And no offense against architects, generally in Ridgefield, architects do high-end stuff, and it's usually pretty nice stuff. So there's a lot of good quality new architecture, but unfortunately the developer component is what we're really facing now. It's about the quality of the design of the neighborhoods, not so much, you know, the over infill, which we're also trying to address. So these are just a few examples. This is a farmhouse, this 18th century farmhouse that was torn down. We got some photographs of it as it came down. We have a demolition delay ordinance. Unfortunately, the owners took a pathway that was rather clever and managed to get it torn down, but I'm not going to get into politics of preservation. This is a nice Dutch colonial. I think we lost that. I tried to convince the owner to save it and build 2 houses next to it. Unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears. I think you all were familiar with the overnight tear down on New Street, which was really the first opportunity Ridgefield had to use the law to tell the developer that you can't just tear down a building without a permit. So that got a lot of attention, which is really good. I threw this slide in just to show you just some of the character details, the wood trim and the amazing amount of detail that goes into it, and the character of wood siding that is just so much more warm than plastic siding. And, I think thank God we moved away from vinyl siding. Our friend Suzanne Brennan, who's the director here at the Lounsbury House, took it upon herself, knowing what a beautiful property she works in here, to write a letter to the editors as a Ridgefielder. And this is sort of the new rationale, which is many rightly worry that the town's character and historical significance are at risk. And I think that's a fantastic statement, because that's exactly what the problem is. Because amidst that building and those characters, there's an amazing amount of history. And I'll say this real quick before I go through all these slides. I'm always amazed at how many important and significant people have lived in Ridgefield. From the high-end mansions to the most modest vernacular homes, somebody's always done something particularly unusual in this town. So it's a real treat that there's that much historical significance associated with these. So I'll just touch on the dreaded 8-30G. For many of us, this is of great concern, because we go from the character of our streetscape, which is rather modest, to the replacement of a building that's out of scale with the neighborhood. These 2 houses on the right were torn down and replaced with these developments. And to give you some sense of scale, up here you can see the size and scale of the houses that were there, and you can see the size of the ones that replaced it. This is a political issue, and this is not a political presentation, so I'm just pointing it out. What I'd like to do right now is introduce Mary Dunne, Certified Local Government and Grants Coordinator. Mary helped me some 20 years ago to get Ridgefield listed as a certified local government. It gives us more access to state help on preservation, and it also gives us quicker access to grants. So we're very delighted to work with Mary, and I'd like to introduce her now.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this really special event. What a great crowd. I literally have to catch a plane, so I did not get a chance. I'm not going to be able to stay and see the presentation, but Phil sent it to me earlier this week, and you all are in for a real treat. So you have that to look forward to. I started working at the State Historic Preservation Office 18 years ago, and met Phil shortly thereafter, as he said. And in fact, Phil called me last week, and we were both saying, have we known each other for 20 years? Are we getting on in years? We're going to have to be part of the next historic resources inventory. But it was Phil, as he just said, that approached me about helping Ridgefield become a certified local government. And for those of you who don't know what a CLG is, it's a preservation partnership between the National Park Service and our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, and the municipality. And so it's federal, state, and local government working together to advance the goals of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And usually the application comes from, well, it always comes from the chief elected official, the mayor, the first selectman. It's he or she that signs the certification agreement. But to be honest, usually the chief elected official really doesn't care. They usually do it at the behest of the Historic District Commission, so they can better do their jobs by accessing economic benefits and advice from our office. So I worked with Phil, and I met with the town, and then I started reading about the town's activities. And I read about First Selectman Rudy Marconi's efforts, way back then, and currently, but in this instant, to try to help preserve the Nehemiah Keeler House. And I was really impressed that that kind of commitment was coming from the top to try to find an alternative to demolition. And even though that was sadly not successful, those actions were exemplary of what we like to see from our CLGs. So I applaud that. And you're not the typical CEO. So when I talked to the Board of Selectmen about becoming a CLG, I told them it was, not much stick, mostly carrot. There's some financial benefits and some advisory stuff that we do. But there are some responsibilities, and primary of which is the Historic Resources Inventory, which you're going to learn about tonight. And for those of you who don't know what an HRI is, it's basically, there's no benefits or restrictions associated with it. So why put the effort forth? Well, it's a basic information gathering tool. Volunteers, or sometimes a paid consultant, or both, will canvass the town to find structures and buildings that have architectural or historical significance to the town. A typical survey has 150 forms, but this one has 300. Each form describes in detail the property and gives it a little bit of history. The survey itself has a very lengthy essay about the architectural and historical significance of the town, so it puts those forms in a context. And why is that important? It's important because in order to incorporate historic preservation into your planning, which is a responsibility of the certified local government, you need to know what you have. You need to be mindful of what you have, and if you want to, as you plan your development, if you want to protect your historic resources, you kind of got to know what they are. You might want to know what you might want to elevate to the status of state and national register listing. And the HRI does that. It makes recommendations for buildings and districts that might be eligible for the National Register. It also identifies resources that are related to women's history or traditionally underrepresented communities. So it really broadens the community's understanding of what's important to your specific town. Also, I hear often when you're debating the demolition of a building, someone stands up and says, well, if it's so important, why hasn't somebody said something already about this? And that's why it's important to put this together and put it in writing so you have a guide as you're moving forward with planning, and also, to back up your argument that yes, this is a potentially important resource that we want to protect. As Phil mentioned, the last major survey was done in 1979, and it was a good survey, but back then, most consultants were concerned with buildings from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Buildings from even the early 20th century weren't really on the radar as being worthy of significance or investigation. But now, in 2025, we use a 50-year perspective or a 50-year threshold to kind of build perspective to determine whether a resource is important or significant historically or architecturally. And so we're looking at buildings that could have been built as late as 1975. I don't think there's any in this survey, but are there? Great. So there you go. We're really bringing the architectural history further into the 20th century, so that's great. As Phil mentioned, I'm just going to close. As Phil mentioned, this was a joint effort between the Ridgefield Historical Society and the town. They kind of packed a 1-2 punch. They got a survey and planning grant, the Historical Society did, non-matching, to hire the consultant, and then the town also took advantage of the supplemental certified local government funding to match it. And we were really happy to be part of that effort, and especially infusing that much funding so that you could really make a significant impact as you're moving forward. So I just want to say congratulations to the town and the Historical Society, and enjoy what Phil and Tracy are going to show you.
Thank you, Mary. It was really helpful. This is why I asked Mary to come, because I can't remember all those details from the state level. But we are delighted to work with Dan O'Brien and the Historic District Commission, because through Rudy and the town, we were able to get that additional funding. And we're going for phase 2 once we finish this one, because we want to make a generational impact on the built environment in Ridgefield. So let's get to the meat and potatoes. So these so-called gems, there's a couple where you'll ask yourself, this is a gem? But I'll try to explain. So it's from the latest survey. It can be any kind of building. High degree of original integrity, particularly massing, scale, the windows, doors, siding, and all buildings go through change. Stuart Brand, the guy who used to write the Whole Earth catalog, for those of you who are old enough to remember him, wrote a book called How Buildings Learn, and it was one of the most impactful books I've ever read, because it really helped me to understand that buildings are constantly changing. And additions and whatnot, not a bad thing, but done well, it's amazing how you can really keep the character of a building intact. And then again, to that same theme, those that have been altered but still express character-defining features well. Character-defining features, particularly in older buildings, are siding and very often windows, door hoods, and architectural details that really give the building its sort of unique signature. And really very often, we may not realize it, but when we look at a building, we go, wow, that's really beautiful. It's because it's a collective of what we're experiencing from the details themselves. But we owe Suzanne a debt of gratitude for this venue tonight. So we have partnered, and outside of the 20, I'm going to do a brief overview of this house, the Lounsbury House. Ridgefield, it just, like I said before, Ridgefield has this extraordinary ability to operate on the state national level through art and architecture and important people, particularly because of its proximity to New York City. But Mr. Lounsbury was a Ridgefield native, and he managed to get himself into the governor's office. He and his brother had a successful business, and the architect is Charles Northrup, and the house is designed and built around 1895. I could find nothing on Charles Northrup except that he was from Bridgeport. I couldn't believe I did a lot of digging. I haven't really dug deep enough yet, but I will. But the original design comes from the Connecticut building from the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. What's significant about this is that Ridgefield has, if you go up on East Ridge, and many houses in town, like this one, it's high-style classical revival architecture with all the bells and whistles. So you have the resort town aspect, which brings the New York money in, and you have this architectural style that's being promoted by the Beaux-Arts movement, and here in Chicago you can see this almost Romanesque type environment, and it found its way into every state, was asked to do a state house. Warren Briggs, well-known architect from Bridgeport, designed the Connecticut building, and Mr. Lounsbury was so fascinated and impressed by it that he hired Charles Northrup to build it here in town for himself. Some of the architectural details of this building are just stunning. When I was on the task force back in 2003, I was really taken by some of the amazing details. The level of detail that goes into all these dormers and all the denticulation and all of this work is just, it's mind-boggling. From a scale point of view, he did dramatize a little bit, like the Ionic columns the caps on them are a little exaggerated. So there's a little bit of drama here as well for the purists. And then, of course, I want to point this out because this stained glass window in the pediment is not what was on the original building. In fact, the original building, this building is really a variation on the original. On the original, up here is the Connecticut State Seal. And you'll notice that the column, these are piers as opposed to a pier and a column, and there are some differences. But it's essentially, it's a shout out to the Connecticut building. So, this is the period where this is known as the beginning of the eclectic period, where architects were using, while they had their basis in classicism, they were using templates from everywhere, Greek, Roman, Federal, and very often what you had was this grand expression, quite unified, but for the purists, some of the details that define it as a late 19th century building are the details. Like, for example, you have your Roman classicism in the swag here and the denticulation, but here in another room you have a Greek key, and even within all this Roman detail, you have a Greek element built into the frieze. So it's just a play. They were playing. They were being artistic, and they were trying to get all these different styles into a unified design, which they did very well. Unlike the Colonial Revival, these typically dark stained doors are typically indicative of late 19th century high style architecture. You find when we get into the Colonial Revival period, we start painting everything white. And in fact, the Colonial Revivalists would have taken this staircase and painted the railings white. Back in 2006, I was chair of the Historic District Commission at the time, and was on the task force, and we designed new signage. And we designed, I used the dormer windows as a template for the sign. And the sign maker did such a great job that he lost a ton of money. So I went and bought him a very, very expensive bottle of scotch, and he was really happy. I think it made up for it. But I was so impressed with the work he did. But Suzanne did new signs, and they're quite lovely, because they don't last forever, unfortunately. All right, moving into the 20 best. Kitty Rose's house on Olmsted Lane. A magnificent period house. I brought notes with me because I can't remember all the details sometimes, but this is a 1.5 story. This is called a raised cape. John Kinnear, who's with us tonight, Architectural Advisory Committee Chair, taught me about the raised cape because I was studying some buildings and didn't quite understand the origins of these. But apparently, according to John and some historians that I looked up, the raised cape is sort of unique to this area, being the area called the Oblong, which is a disputed area between New York State and Connecticut. So Ridgefield, and I did a survey for Fairfield, and we found many of these, New Fairfield, they're also in Dutchess and Putnam counties. It's this really unique 1.5 story where you have a full window exposed on the gable end, but since you've only got a half story here, they would put either a full frieze or they would put little horizontal windows in. Melanie Marks, who I want to give a shout out to, is here tonight. She was on our board. Melanie helped me many, many years ago to figure out the chain of title. Here's an old brochure from the 70s calling it the Stephen Olmsted House, when in fact it was built by Alexander Rezecki. And the Rezeckis had quite a presence in town. Of course, the Olmsteds did as well. But we like to, when we do our research, we like to make sure that the true builders and owners are represented here. This house is a great tour de force of both its original form, which is just this small portion here, with all these multitude of 20th century additions. And here's a floor plan that David Scott did for me back in 2009. And you can see, here's the original form of the building. And in the early 20th century, folks had money and they were celebrating the Colonial Revival. they did a bunch of sort of sensitive additions to keep the character of the house intact for future generations. So this is the kind of care that we hope people take when they enlarge or rehabilitate a historic building. Here's a great example. This is the timber framing that you can see, which is right up here. You can see it rises up above the ceiling and goes to the edge here. This is a modern knee wall, which is just basically a block from where the gable rafter ends go down. So it was great to see that you could still see that detail intact. Number two, the Northrop House. Northrop House is great because it is a perfect example of a vernacular farmhouse from the period. I wasn't sure, I suspected this was a timber frame building, and I don't know if the owners are here, but there's a lot of nuances, a lot of, you learn to read a building when you're in my business, and there's a small detail that I always look for in a period house. You see the gap between these shutters here? Well, there's no gap here, and there's no gap here. Usually an indication is that you've got one of your posts running up the side of the interior of the building. Just something you might look at when you're out and about at some old houses. Because frankly, some of these houses have been remodeled multiple times, and it's not always that easy to read them. But again, you know, talking about the important people in town that keep popping up, Mr. Northrop was a teacher in town, first selectman, and he apparently was very well loved and lived almost 90 years old. So you just see more and more how the houses have historic significance in the town. Number three, the John Keeler House. This house intrigues me because I really don't know enough about it. There's a lot of details going on here that suggest it's sort of a late Victorian, but I'm guessing it probably has some earlier bones and maybe dressed up to be remodeled. This looks like perhaps an addition. The windows, the 6/6, they're probably replaced at some point. So we'd like to learn more about it. The great news about the property and why we chose it is because it still retains its thrown stone walls and its farm character, which is really such an important part of Ridgefield's history, that rural, so many of these places I look at, even into the early 20th century, I'll show you soon, the folks were still farmers and blacksmiths and the sawmill, and you know, we really didn't jump fully into the 20th century until probably around World War I, when things became more manufactured and from outside the big industrial cities. I'd like to learn more. This is a little picture of the Ridgebury Church and the meeting house. This was brought up before. This is a heartbreak, and this is an example of how we could lose something so important to our history through a series of unfortunate events. We were working with the owner, and miscommunication ensued, and they tore it down. So this is the Nehemiah Keeler House, I believe, and I took interior and exterior photographs. And I'm bringing it up as an example of building documentation. We can't save everything. And the Ridgefield Historical Society is a consulting party on the demolition delay ordinance. And we try to work with property owners to convince them to choose alternatives to demolition. And this is a good example of how you can really lose a serious piece of your town's history if you don't stay vigilant. This is really interesting. This, Mr. Sansom, I believe, came from Europe, Switzerland, I believe, or Belgium, and built a sawmill. And even as late as 1860, you're still building sawmills for these rural communities. And I'm intrigued, and haven't, since I don't live here, I didn't have a chance to really go and have a peek at this house, but I'm intrigued by what's left. And I don't know if the owners are here, but I'd love to talk to them about it. We invited all the owners of these properties, by the way, to come tonight as our guest. But you can see the multitude of additions and growth over time. And it adds up to a really sort of warm character that we really were doing, a lot of folks came from New York City, found these old buildings, and put additions on them, and beautified them and made them modern, but still retained their historic feel and character. This is one of my favorites, because this is not an easy style to always identify. This is the stick style, and usually its primary identification is, you know, framing, some degree of horizontality, and these gable-ended verge boards are pushed out and they're decorative typically. This is what I would describe as one of our early national styles. Our first, I say national, when you look back at architectural history, most of our buildings were regionally designed and evolved, but ultimately with the advent of the railroad, the mass production of lumber and publishing, we've developed styles that now enter the whole nation. And the Greek Revival was really the first, I would argue, and then the stick style really was one of the early Victorian era houses or designs that took on this form and expression. You can see it's restrained compared to the later Victorians, although this one is pretty high style. This is a more typical stick style house, where you don't always have, but you often have these matching gable and portico ends, which are decorative. So the fact that this is still here is extraordinary. Another couple of small details. The windows are what we call 2/2 vertical. There's just one muntin in the window, no more 6/6, and they tend to be taller and narrower. And so that's a character-defining feature, I would point out. And of course, the window hood, which is an amazing detail, particularly to have survived into this era. This house, I think, is just amazing, because if you stop and you look at the way this was done, this took a lot of effort. And I don't know much about it. I looked at the form. There was a George Ward estate, and then George Doubleday bought the property sometime later, and we haven't dug in deep enough to know whether or not it was a gardener's cottage. There's been speculation that it was used as a summer rental for the resort folks. But this detail, and the reason I write Queen Anne stick style, is because some of this is sort of like what I call proto-Tudor. It is sort of what they call faux timbering. It's all wood. It's not real timber and plaster in between. It's all wood, but it's highly decorative. But in particular is this curved, and all made up of wood planks, this curved base to this gable. Very, very, very high-end, very decorative. And these usually don't survive, so it's just delightful to see this in town. The Hurlitzer House. This is your quintessential Queen Anne style house, high style house. The owners have done a magnificent job of making sure that all these character-defining features have been kept in place, and they really deserve recognition for doing a beautiful job. Because there are houses that you will walk past, but I would argue that if you walk past this house, you might stop for a minute to sort of take it all in. There's a lot of detail. One notable thing I like to point out when I look at these houses is that if you notice, I look at a lot of historic photos, even though they're black and white, they do give you a sense of schemes. And here you can see there's a this window area is darkened. And this is very typical for the period. So it's a very different expression. This is more of like a colonial revival expression with all the white trim, whereas this is more authentic to the period. This is the Travis House, which is owned by Kitty Rosa and her husband, I believe, for many years, down on Wilton Road in the area. And again, this is a great example of how, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Great example of a vernacular farmhouse, not architect design, but the beauty of it is that it's really super functional, but it also has all of its, or appears to have all of its original massing, character-defining features, And details like this return on this molding, very high style for a vernacular farmhouse. And the original, the siding is wood, you have your stone foundation. It just sits by itself on this magnificent spread of grass with the barn in the back. It's highly noticeable, and that's what these are one of these great examples where people are like, well, it's just an old farmhouse. But it is really part of our character. Yes?
I just have a quick question, Phil. When you know, can you tell us the general location of a house if you know it?
Yeah.
My dream is to drive around Ridgefield and see all the houses. Some are very familiar, but I can't recall where I've seen them. So if
Well,
you have a general sense.
We made a conscious decision not to point out addresses for
No, I wouldn't
for
say
people's
addresses,
homes.
but like Branchville or Ridgebury.
Yeah, this is Wilton Road East, I believe,
Okay.
if that's okay. This is closer in town, around the New Street area. This is a great house. I fell in love with this house when I saw it because most people wouldn't really take the time to get a good look at this house. But the effort it took to build this point in this Tudor Revival style house is great. A couple of things. It's not high style. It's rather modest. It's a working person's house for the period. I don't think there are any working people's houses left in Ridgefield at this point, which is fine. But it really has a tremendous amount of character. I talked to the owner, and she explained to me how they were very careful to put this door in so that it was period correct. And the fact that it just has its original form, it's that perfect Depression-era modest home. And we found out that the home down on the corner was built by Aldo Bacchiocchi, and anyone who's been in town knows that name very well. And he built that house some 20 years earlier, and he built this house for his son, 3 or 4 houses down. It's maintained a tremendous amount of original integrity, and I felt it needed to be pointed out. By comparison, I just want to show you Tudor Revival in many of these styles can go from the extremely simple and modest and almost vernacular to the high style. So this house is in Queens. It's an apartment building. These two are in Ridgefield. This is I call it the pizza building, but that's not really fair. But you can see Ridgefield doesn't have a lot of Tudor Revival. Ridgefield has a lot of classical revival. You go down to Westchester and you're just overwhelmed by Tudor Revival. So to see it here in Ridgefield is always a treat, particularly a building as dominant as this one is on the streetscape. If you look, they even went through the trouble of doing the dormers with the decorative faux timbering. It's gone now, but the dormers are still there, but that detail, those are the details collectively that add up, that make you really grow to love an old building. Stripping off character-defining features really waters down some of these great old buildings. And this is the original house behind St. Jesse Lee Memorial. I always say St. Stephen's. Behind Jesse Lee Memorial, and this is the epitome of artistic design in architecture. I mean, this is a magnificent home, inside and out. I've spent a lot of time looking at it, photographing it. There's a whole group of outbuildings down in the parking lot that are remarkably intact, and the church deserves so much credit for caring for those, because that adds to our character of our streetscape. This one, I love estate houses, particularly in Ridgefield, and this one I was completely unaware of. And I really had a good look at this one, and of course this is the Luce house, Henry and Claire Booth Luce. And this house was built in 1938, which is late for the estate era. And I mean, that is to say, the great estates were mostly built between around 1890 and 1930. Once the Depression hit, it stopped. But this house was built a little bit later, and I find it to be a great example of a real American house built for Americans. So it reads English, Georgian, but there are a whole lot of things about it that are uniquely American, and I just wanted to point some of those things out. It's decidedly stately, but I want to point out a few details about the nuance. I'll start with the interior, And just a acknowledgement to Jack Sanders for his magnificent book on Ridgefield's great estates. So happy he did it because it was long overdue. But I want to point out some of the details. So a lot of these houses, particularly Georgian colonial revival, in the teens and 20s, were very elaborate. A lot of crown molding, a lot of architectural details, like this house. This one, you'll notice there's a great deal of restraint in the execution of the rooms. The moldings are not brassy or bold. The doors, the trim is rather modest. Everything is, the only real notable thing is the likely they would import these fireplace surrounds from England and install them in the house. That was a common thing to do for a Georgian house. But I just wanted to point out, and there are other examples of Georgian houses in Ridgefield, like Oronica, which is the complete opposite. But I just want to point out, before I get into that comparison, here's your quintessential English Georgian, highly symmetrical. Now you get into your American Georgian, still highly symmetrical, very, honoring that style. And even much later, you get to Oronica, very, very symmetrical in execution. The one thing I noticed about this particular building, particularly as you're getting into the 1930s, the architecture being influenced by the modern movement and Art Deco and more restraint in decoration. And this is what I wanted to point out about these great estate houses. And if you look at the way this facade is done, it looks highly symmetrical. And yet you'll notice that the two windows above are a little bit smaller and offset from their partners. And you have these paired windows, probably for a butler's office or a restroom or a coat room. And then you have this one lone one up here. The point I'm trying to make is that you wouldn't notice this if you were just looking at it. You were looking at this grand facade, and yet it's very atypical for a High Georgian style. And I'm talking to John Kinnear, who's the president of the American Friends of the Georgian Group. So if you need to correct me, now's your chance.
No, you're doing fine.
So I wanted to, oops, I think I lost my microphone. I wanted to point out the floor plan too. This is what makes it such a uniquely American house. And I think it's true of most of the estate houses, but I haven't seen the floor plans for many. You have this high style Georgian house, but you've got the living room and the pool house and the dining room and these, these very sort of like casual rooms, not highly formal rooms, but more for American living, which is comfortable and relaxing. These are weekend homes. So it's just something to notice that the architects, while they were honoring this English heritage, they were really building these houses for Americans, wealthy Americans. Oronica is, in my opinion, the finest house in town. It is executed in every way in the highest quality materials and expensive masonry work, and it's just interior and exterior. It's magnificent. If you ever get a chance to go up there and spend any time, I was very fortunate to have been able to do so. Limestone and fieldstone and everything was. I could do a presentation on this house alone, just incredible. But by comparison to this house, and this house I think was built as late as 30 or 31, so it was right at the end of the Depression. This house is fully dramatic with all the bells and whistles, with the moldings and the fancy expression in the staircase. So by comparison to the Loose house, it's far more elaborate. Loose house is much more restrained. Now, speaking of modest, this is great because these are the houses that define Ridgefield in the middle class era. I don't know why I call it the middle class era, but having grown up in Ridgefield, I grew up in the middle class era, where many of us, whether we lived in a big house or whatever, we were very much on the same playing field. And that's a social phenomenon that has sort of disappeared, but I find it quite fascinating, particularly living in Ridgefield or being in Ridgefield at this day and age. But this is a really interesting house because this property And Nancy, I don't know where it is, because the addresses are going on in my head. This is property that was inherited by Mr. Lounsbury's niece, Sarah. And Sarah subdivided this property, started a company, and built all these houses. But the one thing she instituted was some zoning into her development. She had some restrictions, which was no cheaper than $4,000 to build, things like that. No commercial buildings, and she was very adamant that it had to retain that neighborhood feel. So Ridgefielders have cared about the quality of the built environment from very early on. And this is a subject, I've done some research on watching things develop in town over the years. The wealthy and powerful people who are the summer people who often lived here year round, they had an awful lot of say in what was built and what was not built. And they had a lot of sway, I'll put it to you that way. I'll give you one real quick example. Ridgefield Playhouse, not the Prospector, which is done in what I call late period colonial revival, because if you look at it, it's rather straightforward. There's nothing highly elaborate, but it's a beautiful building, brick with the white trim. I found an article in the Ridgefield Press where they designed the original building was designed, the Playhouse was designed by a New York architect, a theater architect, and there's a picture of it in the paper, or a drawing. It's a Venetian palazzo, the most completely out of context building you could imagine for Prospect Street in Ridgefield. So, for whatever reason, I followed the articles, next couple of articles, all of a sudden, the design changed. There was no mention of anybody involved or anything like that, but it was so night and day. You can see that the people in this town always cared about the character of it, because we inherited the colonial, and the New Yorkers came with their money, and they used that colonial as a backdrop for the country life era. And they built their beautiful homes. They were some large and impressive, but they were still country homes. And they cared that the environment that they were building their home in was maintained townwide. This is a little bit later. This is a great, perfect example of a period Cape Cod house. Interesting that it's built 41 to 44. Usually there weren't a whole lot of houses built during war. So I'm guessing it's probably a little bit before World War II. But it's extremely modest. It's extremely modest in its execution. A little bit later, post-war, first post-war. This is an interesting house. I created, the neighbors hired me many years ago to create a National Register Historic District of the south end of North Salem Road, because they were concerned about what actually transpired, as you saw in the early slide. And this was one of the houses in that district that was much, much later, because when they first developed this, there was going to be a railroad spur that came in. Here's where Joe's Corner is, here, I think. And here's where North Street starts, and here's where North Salem starts. Can you imagine a railroad depot right there? But this was what they laid out. And so they sold these lots and developed these properties. The railroad never came in. Many of these houses were built pre-war. This one was built in '47. Great example of how, when you're describing a building, you're like colonial revival style, what does that mean? Well, we call this minimal traditional because it's not your typical gabled, sided colonial revival, but it's small, it's modest. People didn't have a lot of money after the war. They were building new lives, and you have character features like this cross gable here with the front. In particular, things you'll notice are these large multi-paned windows, which the form of the building will tell you, and also the exterior chimney. That will usually be a good indication that you're looking at something a little bit later in the colonial revival period, which, by the way, the colonial revival is still going on. It's had so many iterations since the late 19th century. We're not always sure how to categorize them. This house, I think, was a particular gem because it's extremely well executed. It's a cape. but it has its colonial revival character, and it's a little showier than the one I showed you a little bit before, with the engaged dormers with the brackets underneath. A lot of character-defining features. The heavy siding, and this Regency-style portico, which is really indicative of the period. Just a beautiful home. This is one of my favorites. So, having grown up in Ridgefield, I grew up in Twixt Hills, which is a two-show development. And the houses are generally variations on a theme. They're typically either split level or a two-story neo-colonial buildings, for if you need another term. And the thing I love about this building is not only is it pretty late for this style of house, 1976, but it also has this what I call Mount Vernon Piazza running across the front, which is reminiscent of Mount Vernon. And I just thought, this is, this is the bicentennial. This is what people were thinking that would be a handsome house. The interesting thing about the development, and I've avoided a lot of history because there's just so much time we have, and I don't want to overwhelm everyone with too much information, so I'm focusing on the architecture. But what's so interesting to me is that that this style house was so prevalent for a good 20 years, and that even after so many of them have been now remodeled, this one's still pretty much intact, which ultimately will make it historic, if you can believe that. The last one I'm going to do, and then I'm going to hand it off to Tracy for the modernist era, is Eight Lakes Estates, which was, for those who don't know, is part of the Port of Missing Men development back, started in the 30s or 40s. I don't see Jack, but I know it was, they did, the town instituted a different zoning for summer residents and year-round residents within this development, or perhaps all over town. But Eight Lakes is great because it's just, first of all, it's huge, and it's on the edge of New York State, and you have this tremendous variety of buildings. You've got your modest farmhouse, which is likely 19th century, although the windows were replaced, so I couldn't really get a good read. Although this overhanging gable is usually a pretty good indication that it's a little bit earlier. But now you have your summer cottages, and ultimately they were expanded in the back for modern living in the 60s and 70s, I imagine. And then of course you have the development houses of the late 50s throughout the 60s and early 70s. And this is where we sort of transition. Ridgefield has this attachment to its colonial past. So even today when we're building these beautiful new houses, I'm critical of the McMansion period because they put too much emphasis on size and not enough emphasis on quality design. And the architects in town recognized that, and I saw them improve that a lot. I was very impressed. So a lot of the houses that were built in the last 15 years or so have been a tremendous improvement over the McMansions. And but in this period, we're getting more and more influence of modernism. So it starts in the schools, in the universities, and they're encouraged to be experimental and to do modernist design. And so you start to see it in some of these, and these are what I call cookie cutter. They're plan book houses, many of them. They're not architect design per se, but they're built en masse, and you could buy these plans. This one I'm not convinced is a plan house. This one is very unusual, in which you have your dominant colonial revival theme with the portico and the colonial revival door with the overhead, but then you've got this casement windows right up to the eave, which speaks more to modernism. So modernism is really takes hold in Ridgefield in ways that are great fun. Not like New Canaan, but we have our own version of it. And I'd like to introduce Tracy Seem, who was introduced earlier, and she's our resident modernist expert.
Okay, oh, yes, thank you. Make sure my notes keep me on track.
Phil. Modernism in Connecticut, I'm going to try to give a very brief summary because our state has an incredible modernist footprint. We've just looked at all of these wonderful, can you hear me? No, not really.
Better.
Good. Okay. The modernist footprint in Connecticut is significant. And what's really exciting about this recent inventory is that we have a few wonderful buildings that we can highlight. We have great examples. Phil spoke about New Canaan. It's hard for us to talk about modernism without referencing New Canaan. New Canaan was a real hotspot for important architects post-World War II. These architects are coming really influenced by the Bauhaus, which was a school that was developed in Germany in 1919, and they were 100% rejecting what this building really says. They're saying, let's get away from all of this detail and extra and get down to just the pure material, the craftsmanship, the interaction with nature. When we hear these cliches of form following function, the function dictates the form. It's good design. So the Bauhaus had a lot of really incredible architects like Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe. The Seagram building is a great example of that. If you know the Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chair, really important architects. But again, the modernism in Connecticut is really, I have to get used to my, sorry, here we go. Modernism in Connecticut is beginning with this man, Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson's American architect. He's born in 1906. He dies in 2005. I always like to point out those dates in my tours because you really have to think that lifespan is really bookending the entire 20th century. So you have to think of what he's influenced by and all that he really did influence in our architecture today. But this building here is really what brought modernism from the Bauhaus into Connecticut. This is the Glass House. It's completed in 1949. The building is a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You can visit it. It's open April through December, and you can really have a great tour and history of more about modernism in Connecticut. But the reason I pointed out, because this building and then this building, which is built in 1951, directly across the street, called the Hodgson House. These two buildings are really speaking to what we have here in, sorry, I can't see, in Ridgefield. This building, if you're not familiar with it, is the Schlumberger Administration Building. With Philip Johnson building the Glass House, he really was the master of marketing. He loved talking about what he did. He loved having people over, and he really wanted to spread the word of what this modernism was. So one day, Annette Schlumberger and Henry Dahl, who were looking to open a corporate headquarters in the countryside in Connecticut, wanted a really fantastic building. So again, this idea of having a corporate headquarters in the countryside was groundbreaking. So they wanted groundbreaking architecture. They wanted to attract the best and the brightest from around the world and bring them to the countryside and create this new type of living and working. They hired Philip Johnson to build the first commercial building. The building is the international style. The Glass House is ushering in this international style from the Bauhaus. And this again, very simple. Single story, glass, brick. There's nothing extra. It's all the purity, it's all the material. And one thing that you don't see when you see these buildings, the Glass House represents it because there's an interaction with nature because you can see it. But what I love about most modernist buildings that are done really well, because a lot of times people, I think, challenge modernism, saying, oh, it's so cold, it's so, dark, but not if it's done right. So this building, you see the outside, it's pretty modest. It's a nice enough building, brick, glass. But when you go through those doors, there's really this element of surprise because there's so much natural light in the building. And that's what the modernist architects were doing. They were bringing in light, and they wanted the experience of being in a building to be important as well. So this building is 1952, so we have the Glass House 49, Hodgson House 51, and then this building in 1942. Sorry, I put my glasses to be able to see these. And then we have, sorry, I go backwards, Schlumberger building. The Schlumberger headquarters was here for many years, but they left in the early 2000s, and the buildings were left, really, and all the services were cut. The building was in disrepair. I think that it was I know many of you were on the committees here trying to figure out what to do with this property. It was 45 acres. It was a lot of buildings that were, laboratories, so very specific. But the Schlumberger building and the theater below were fortunately saved. The town ultimately bought the property. A lot of the property was sold off for other purposes, but this building was kept, thankfully, as well as the theater below. There's a group called the Bassam Fellows Design Group. Craig Bassam is an architect and his partner, a creative designer. They worked really hard for many years to pursue this building, to be able to preserve the building. They're pretty good at what they do. They've restored a Willis Mills building in New Canaan, and that building is listed on the National Register. And also they restored a Philip Johnson building that's on the National Register. So they really were a perfect match for this. They have meticulously restored the building. It is absolutely beautiful. When I say, it takes your breath away, I really always encourage people to go to a modernist building, because I work in this building and we never turn the lights on, except at night. There's 80 skylights. There's an interior courtyard. It's just light. All the offices have windows that open up into nature. So, it's a really wonderful experience, even on a work day. But again, Bassam Fellows did an amazing job. They really used this building to encourage architects and designers to learn about the style through what they do. They do a lot of historic preservation. They have a furniture line, but they're really very committed to this movement that was happening in Connecticut. This is more. Another great example. Again, modest building. A lot of you may have been to it, maybe your kids have gone here, but Veterans Park School is a great example of another architect, Willis Mills. He's living in New Canaan. He's building his own, his own house here, but he's also commissioned to build this little school across the street. And I'm very good at these because I can't see. It's a little bit dark. Okay, here we go. This Veterans Park School, I want to go one more, is again a great example of this international style. This I can show more details, not just a flat roof, but they're incorporating this wonderful sloped roof. If you look at a lot of modernist mid-century houses or buildings, there's this wonderful clerestory window. This is a great, again, function is so important in this architecture, so you can utilize this whole wall for storage, artwork, but then you have this window above that allows for natural light. Again, light is the component, and this great entryway, this kind of, Phil calls it the Jetson entryway, but it's very mod, but it's also bringing you in. It's inviting you to curve you into this building, the entrance. Hard to see, but again, this wall, fieldstone, using material that's in the area. You can see it a little bit more here. And then, hopefully I'm using the right one, I'm not. And then the interior. I can tell you today, no one is using mahogany paneling on walls. I mean, this is incredible material. Again, mahogany. Look at these chairs with the bronze, really incredible detail. But again, he's building his house. He has mahogany walls here. All the window details are the similar details to this building. So it's a great relationship of what was happening in New Canaan, this modernist boom, and then what we were doing here. This is a wonderful commercial building in modernism. If anyone has grown up in this area, you can't forget the Tom Carvel commercials and advertising, and this shape. So again, modernism is using architecture for more of a purpose than just a dwelling. So in this case, the building itself becomes or identifies with the product, right? So you know this shape. It really is the Carvel or ice cream building. So they were all over the east, or not all over the country, but they were up and down the East Coast from Maine to Florida. And Carvel likes to think that I don't have a record of this, but they believe that they were the ones who designed this slope roof and this sheer front. And again, iconic for this particular brand, using, again, this side, the parapets, to advertise, using the architecture as almost the sign. We're so lucky that the building has been purchased by someone in town. Again, great preservation at work. The building was meticulously restored. Now it's Flobies. They've done a great adaptation with really being true to that original shape, using the sign on each side, because again, when people were driving by in the past, you had to know what it was from each side so it could bring you in. So again, these have become a really important part of our culture, and our architectural culture. So modernism, again, it has this real incredible footprint. This architect I found really interesting. So Philip Johnson, he's coming from the Bauhaus. This is a totally very, very definite school. There also was an architect that was working in the United States before Johnson. They kind of overlapped. He's about a generation before, is Frank Lloyd Wright. If you look at this building, this looks very much what Frank Lloyd Wright, the way that he was building. Frank Lloyd Wright was building what's called the prairie style, also working with nature, but typically into the landscape. As you can see, these horizontal lines that also line up with the landscape. He often has these walls of windows in a row, typically cantilevered structures that, again, that are in the landscape in a way that you can view the landscape. But again, this is not really the Bauhaus style. Alan Gelbin, really interesting, again, architect. He was Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentice, and he was working on a house in New Canaan. It's called Tirana, 1955, and he kind of caught on to this wave of enthusiasm that was happening in New Canaan. If you're not familiar, New Canaan has almost, I think we always say there's somewhere between, so you may know, between 80 and 90 modernist houses, but at one point there were 120. That's one of the largest concentrations of residential modernist buildings in one place. So we can't help, we can't help but be affected by this and influenced by this in Ridgefield. Gelbin, interesting, working for Frank Lloyd Wright, starts getting commissioned. He has 3 really interesting houses in New Canaan. This is still the building in Ridgefield. Again, really beautiful, into built into the landscape. This is an old photo of it before it was restored. This is the handsome young architect. Had a long life, really great career all through Connecticut. But you can see this is one of his buildings in New Canaan. I find him interesting because his influence is a little bit of Prairie School, a little bit of modernism, and he did it well and he achieved it really well. But again, modernism in Connecticut, I always say you can do a deep dive. I encourage people to look. What I love about Connecticut is that you can be going through these wonderful colonial villages, like this village, and then all of a sudden you might have whiplash because you're like, wait, that looks like a Marcel Brewer post office, and it is. So, there is this wonderful line. There's great house tours in New Canaan. The Museum and Historical Society has a modern house tour every 2 years. Great way to learn about architectural buildings, houses that are kind of tucked into the wilderness, and also learn about what people are doing today, because these principles are strong and we're still building in this way today. So that is my modernism in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm so grateful that Tracy took that component from me because it's not my area of expertise. I'm fascinated by it, but not quite up to speed. Just point out, this is not a typo. It is, in fact, Canaan, Connecticut. I just am going to go quickly through, oh, you missed one. This house, to me, is the quintessential modern ranch house in Ridgefield. when I say ranch, it's not really a ranch house, but it has that feel, that one-story platform, and the Brady Bunch beams and whatnot. This is the detail I was pointing out earlier, this clerestory window pushed right up to the eave with this big massive wall below it in the transitional house. I'm going to go really quickly because we're wrapping it up. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't just pick 20 buildings. There's so much great stuff out there. So I'm just going to point out some stuff real quick and we'll wrap it up. Notable mention, I have about 10 or 15 of these. The Casagmo barn, which is just, it's like, if you hate Casagmo for good reason, because it's ugly, I mean, it needs help stylistically, but that is an icon, that building. It's just remarkable. And this is another example of an outbuilding in Ridgefield in the Gilded Age where they put a lot of money into even their outbuildings. Here's a great example of a true period house that's been colonial revitalized, as I like to say. So here you have a house built in 1800, Georgian, I would argue, Georgian farmhouse. But here, some subtle details come in. I would be convinced that this is not original. What do you think, John?
Probably was added later.
Okay, so colonial revival. The dormers, I call them the West Hartford 3. Always 3 dormers with the decorative windows in the top and the quintessential sun porch, real 20th century details. So, but the form and the massing are all authentic, and it really gives it that great read. And of course, the quintessential well house. This house has so much going on, it's unbelievable. This doorway itself, I mean, this has got to be, you say this is a gem? Well, the thing about this house is when you start reading it, like, what is going on with this denticulation here in the gable, and why is this such a high style, almost federal or even Greek revival type doorway? There's just a whole lot going on, and this is the kind of house that we love to dig into and find out really what's beneath it all. And of course you have your 1950s asbestos siding, and your Home Depot framing on your porch. Joe's Corner, it's an icon again from our youth. And here it is as a Texaco station back in the early days. And this building is really lovely. It's a nice Tudor revival. But here's the original form of the building, and you can see the door and the window opening is the same. And I think this is, to me, this is iconic because it is really gives Ridgefield's downtown sort of that commercial feel. Because many of the other buildings are of the period. I mean, when you go back in time and you look at it from the early days, it was really given its Ridgefield's downtown its sort of first commercial look. Here's Ridgefield Hardware in 1920 or so. But and anyone who grew up in Ridgefield is happy to see that there's still a photo there where it says squashes. This building is fascinating to me because even as a kid I thought this building was always a wreck. And yet, I was always fascinated by its style and its design. And so much of this modernistic detail in this building, it's just great fun. This building on Main Street always strikes me as being out of place because it's one of the only buildings that looks like it's modest and it has no, it's even a little bit rough looking compared to all the pristine buildings that surrounds it. But it really has a lot of great form, massing, original details, and a little left over from the period, the decorative shingles up in here, and this verge board, and just a little curve on the edge where the shingles terminate. Those are the things that you don't always see, but you register, and that's why you might say, oh, that's a nice building, even though it's rather plain in a general sense. And to me, I love the modernist ranch, because it's just, you've got these pointed ends on the hip roof. It's just such great fun. Almost Californian flavor. And Westmoreland has some really great survivors. This one's interesting because it's like we're struggling for an identity between traditional form and modernistic sort of siding. Here it's slanted, here it's vertical. Just fascinating to me. And also the fact that this, you can see where this gable goes to the end and then it's cut out. This piece is cut out. Just a little play on form. You can't not mention the split level. It's like so ubiquitous that it has to be mentioned. And some are so pure and so original that I had to call one out. And this is a great combination of art moderne and 1850 farmhouse down on Nathan Allen Highway. This building is remarkably intact, these details. It's really quite beautiful if you appreciate that period. And last but not least, the contemporary from 1968, once again trying to figure out what style it wants to be a little bit, but it's still a beautiful house and well executed, particularly with the windows that cover the gable end here. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. We ran a little over. I don't have to be asked twice to do these. I love them. I'm not the greatest public speaker, but this is such a great subject, and I have such a passion for Ridgefield and the quality of our architecture, our built environment, that we fight for it. So thank you for coming.